The cold metal of the Vox grill crackled to life, filling the dimly lit chamber with the voice of an old man, his words rasping with the weight of 1,000 lives lost to the endless horrors of the Imperium. He spoke of fate, of the countless soldiers who had given everything for a cause they could never fully understand, and of the brutal realities of war that awaited all who dared to challenge the Emperor's will. But it was not the words that held the crowd's attention. It was the cold, unrelenting truth in his voice. In the darkened corners of the galaxy, there were no heroes, only survivors. Those who challenged the Emperor's will were not just enemies. They were doomed to a fate more terrible than death itself. And as the story unfolds, the cold shadows of the 41st millennium draw ever closer. Before we continue this journey through the murky depths of the Imperium, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Your support allows us to uncover the hidden truths of this galaxy. Join the ranks, for the Emperor's light shines brightest in the darkest of places. The battlefield was silent now, its cries fading into the distant hum of the war engines. The survivors stood alone, facing the remnants of their once glorious banner, now soiled with the ashes of the dead. It had been a battle like any other, ruthless, unyielding, but it was the aftermath that weighed most heavily upon them. They had fought for years under the banner of the Emperor, believing that the light of Terra would guide them through every storm. But the light had dimmed, fading in the shadows of betrayal and despair. And yet there was no time to mourn. The war raged on, the Imperium's demands unrelenting. The soldiers were no longer warriors, but tools, mere cogs in the massive grinding machine of the Imperium. Once they had sworn an oath to the Emperor, their hearts full of fire and righteousness. But as the years bled into one another, the fire had flickered, then sputtered, leaving nothing but cold ashes. It wasn't the enemies they fought that drained their spirits. It was the very system that had once promised salvation, now turned against them, tightening its grip with every passing day. There was nothing noble in war, nothing heroic in death. It was survival. Every day, the soldiers struggled to hold on to the belief that they were part of something greater, something worthy of their sacrifice. But deep inside, they knew that this was a lie. The Imperium had no place for the weak, no mercy for the broken. In the end, it was a matter of survival, not honor. Another day, another battle, muttered Sergeant Varos, his voice hollow, as he wiped the blood from his hands, staring at the ruined battlefield. His words echoed in the empty space around him. The others, his comrades, his brothers, did not speak, for there were no words left. There had been no glory here, no triumph, only the crushing weight of the inevitable. They had been betrayed, not by their enemies, but by the very cause they had once believed in. The long years had worn them down. The constant war, the endless grind of combat, had stripped away their humanity. They had become machines, programmed to kill, to survive, and nothing more. Even the promises of victory had faded into memory, leaving only the cold reality of what they had become. What had they fought for? What had been the point of all this suffering? Varos looked around at the shattered bodies, the wounded, the dead. Their eyes were hollow, their faces gaunt from hunger and fatigue. Even in death there was no peace, no rest for the weary. The Emperor's light had failed them. It was a bitter truth, but one they could not deny. They had fought for him, bled for him, and yet they were left with nothing but ruin. The survivors gathered around the makeshift fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering light. No one spoke. What was there to say? The Emperor had once promised them strength, protection, victory. But where was he now? The Emperor, the golden god they had once worshipped, had become nothing more than a distant myth, a faint memory on the edge of their shattered minds. They had given everything, and for what? To die in the name of an empire that didn't care if they lived or died? The wind howled through the desolate landscape, carrying with it the scent of decay. It was the smell of death, of failure, of a once great civilization crumbling under the weight of its own arrogance. There were no more prayers for victory, no more calls for strength. The soldiers knew the truth now. There was no salvation. There was only survival. And for them, survival had become a hollow, empty goal. In the distance, the echo of approaching war machines rumbled. The battle would soon resume, and the survivors would once again take up their weapons. They had no choice. But as they prepared for the next assault, there was a quiet realization that settled deep within their hearts. This was no longer a fight for the Emperor. It was a fight for their own lives, nothing more. The Emperor's will was distant, irrelevant. The only thing that mattered now was survival. Varro stood, his fists clenched at his sides. His mind was numb, his body broken. But he still held on to one final, fragile thread of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was something worth fighting for beyond the Emperor's light. Something more than this endless war, this unyielding darkness. "Prepare yourselves," he said quietly, his voice steel over rust. "This is far from over." The others nodded, their faces set, but inside they all knew the truth. The war would never end. Not for them, not for anyone. It was an eternal battle, one that drained the very soul from those who fought it. And no matter how many battles they won, no matter how many lives they took, the price was always the same. Their faith had been shattered, and in its place was only the cold, bitter reality of what it meant to be a soldier in the Imperium of man. The fog of war hung heavy in the air, thickening the haze of smoke and blood that painted the battlefield. It had been hours since the last shots rang out, but still, the remnants of the enemy forces lingered in the shadows, biding their time, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. The survivors, now fewer in number, began to pick through the wreckage, scavenging what little they could find to stay alive. The price of defiance was a heavy one, and these soldiers, once proud, once powerful, were now little more than ghosts of their former selves, living only by the slimmest of margins. They had challenged the Emperor's will, whether directly or indirectly. Whether by weakness or strength, it did not matter. The Imperium did not tolerate defiance, not from its soldiers, not from its leaders, not from any who swore allegiance to the Emperor. There were always consequences for those who strayed from the path of duty, and those consequences were merciless. Captain Inarus had learned this lesson the hard way. Once he had been a loyal servant of the Imperium, rising through the ranks with a fierce sense of duty and pride. But over time, the unrelenting grind of endless campaigns had worn him down. The promises of victory, the sacred oaths to the Emperor, all began to feel like lies. His men, his brothers, were dying in droves, sacrificed for the ambitions of distant bureaucrats who had never stepped foot on a battlefield. And for what? To hold on to a broken empire? To watch the weak and the innocent be slaughtered in the name of a god-king who had long since ceased to care? It was in that moment, when Inarus had stood upon the field, the weight of his choices pressing down upon him, that he had made a decision. He would defy the Emperor, not in open rebellion, not in a loud cry of protest, but in the quiet defiance of withdrawing his men from a battle he knew was pointless. That small act, that single choice, had condemned him. The Emperor's will was clear. There could be no room for weakness, no mercy for those who faltered in the face of duty. Inarus had been stripped of his rank, cast out from his regiment and branded a traitor. His men had been scattered, sent to fight in the most unforgiving corners of the galaxy. Some had died, others had been broken, lost to the void, and Inarus, now little more than a fugitive, had been left to wander, haunted by the consequences of his decision. It was a bitter truth, one that tasted like ashes in his mouth. To defy the Emperor, even in the smallest of ways, was to sign one's own death warrant. The Imperium had no place for those who questioned its authority, no room for those who sought to do what was right in the face of impossible odds. To defy was to risk everything. And even when that defiance came from a place of desperation, even when it was driven by the desire to protect those who had sworn loyalty, it was unforgivable. The wind howled through the desolate landscape, stirring
the dust and debris that littered the field. Inarus stood alone, his back against the wreckage of a fallen transport, staring out at the barren horizon. His thoughts were consumed by regret, by the faces of his men, by the lives lost because of his decisions. He had once believed that the Imperium was worth the sacrifice, worth the pain. But now, as he gazed into the empty void of space, he saw nothing but a cold, uncaring machine, grinding away the lives of all who served it. "Is this what it means to serve?" he whispered to himself. To throw away everything for a lie? There was no answer. There never was. As he made his way through the wreckage, the quiet hum of the Vox grill buzzed to life. A voice crackled through the static, the words barely intelligible. It was a message from a high-ranking officer, one of the many who had played a part in the chain of command that had led to his downfall. Inarus felt a deep, gnawing anger in his chest, but he said nothing. There was no point. The voice on the other end was just another cog in the machine, another puppet following orders that meant nothing in the grand scheme of things. The message ended, and silence once again claimed the battlefield. Inarus stood still for a moment longer, feeling the weight of the universe pressing down on him. He had been a fool to think there could ever be redemption in the Imperium. It had no use for those who doubted, no place for those who sought to change the tide of history. In the distance, the faint rumble of an approaching convoy stirred the dust at his feet. Another battle was coming, another chance to prove himself, to survive. But what was the point? What was the cost of another life, another soul lost to the machine? Inarus closed his eyes, letting the bitter winds wash over him. He had made his decision, and the price of that defiance had been paid. But in the end, he was left with nothing. No glory, no honor. Just the cold, brutal reality of what it meant to stand against the Emperor. The ground trembled beneath the weight of the advancing war machines, a deafening roar that drowned out all other sound. The smell of promethium and burning flesh hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. The soldiers of the Imperium marched forward, their faces a mask of grim determination, their armor stained with the blood of countless foes. They had no choice but to fight, to survive, to carry on in the name of an emperor who had long since faded into myth. Sergeant Tullis gripped his chainsword tightly, the vibration of its teeth thrumming against his palm. His eyes were cold, devoid of emotion, for he had long since learned that to show any weakness in the face of war was to invite death. His squad moved in perfect synchrony, each step a calculated motion, each breath a measured intake. This was the only rhythm they knew now. This was their life. War had become a cycle, a never-ending loop of violence, death, and destruction. Once, Tullis had fought with pride, believing in the Emperor's righteous cause. Now he fought only because there was no other choice. Every day, the soldiers pressed onward,
grinding through battle after battle with no end in sight. Each victory brought them no closer to peace, each loss no more than a blip in the grand, uncaring expanse of the Imperium. The world they fought on was a barren wasteland, its surface scorched and cratered from countless bombardments. There were no civilians left, no cities to defend, no homes to protect, just the endless war. Tullus could still remember the first time he had landed on this planet, the hope that had filled him as he saw the once proud banners of the Imperium fluttering in the wind. But that hope had long since been extinguished, crushed beneath the boots of those who had come before him and those who would come after. The planet was dead, and the war would continue until there was nothing left to fight for. "Overwatch reports contact in the Western Quadrant," Sergeant Pharos, the squad's Vox operator, muttered, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of gunfire. He glanced over at Tullus, his face tight with worry. "It's going to be another long one, Sergeant." Tullus nodded without a word. He didn't need to hear the specifics. He already knew what was coming. The enemy forces were relentless, like a tide that could never be held back, no matter how many waves were broken upon the shore. They were like the countless foes the Imperium had fought before. Flesh, metal, and unyielding will. They would not stop, would not yield until the last soldier was dead. As they approached the enemy's stronghold, the noise of battle grew louder, sharper. The sky was painted in streaks of fire as artillery shells rained down, exploding on impact, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Tullus felt the vibrations through the soles of his boots, a constant reminder that they were walking on the edge of annihilation. He could almost taste the acrid tang of smoke in the air, the bitter flavor of war. It was familiar now, a taste he had come to know all too well. His squad advanced with deadly precision, moving through the ruined cityscape as shadows among the ruins. Every corner was a potential threat, every movement a risk. The enemy was out there, lurking in the rubble, waiting to strike. But the soldiers of the Imperium had learned to adapt, to survive. They had learned to fight in the dark, to kill without hesitation. "On my mark," Tullus ordered, his voice low but firm. He raised his chainsword, the hum of its teeth growing louder as he prepared for the charge. "Prepare to engage." The signal was given, and the squad erupted into motion, their weapons flashing in the dim light. The first enemy appeared from the shadows, a hulking brute clad in crude armor, its weapon raised in defiance. It never had a chance. Tullus's chainsword tore through it like paper, the blood spraying in all directions, coating the ground beneath their feet. The battle was brutal, savage, a blur of motion and violence. Tullus moved with the fluidity of a man who had been trained for this very purpose. His chainsword cleaved through flesh and bone, each strike fueled by the simple desire to survive, to keep moving forward. His men followed his lead, their faces set, their eyes hollow with the knowledge that there was no escape from this hell. And yet, despite the carnage, despite the constant threat of death, Tullus felt something shift within him, a spark of something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't fear, nor was it anger. It was something deeper, something that had been buried beneath the weight of years spent in the trenches. The realization hit him like a slap to the face. This wasn't just survival, this was something more. This was their purpose. But what exactly was that purpose? The enemy forces were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless, but the soldiers of the Imperium pressed on, fighting as though there were no tomorrow. For them, there was no future, no hope of peace. There was only war, and war was what they knew best. Tullus fought with the knowledge that there would be no end to it, that the cycle would continue long after he was gone. And yet, as his chainsword struck again and again, he could not help but wonder, when did the line between survival and destruction blur? When did they stop fighting for the Emperor and begin fighting for the sake of the fight itself? The city burned, its towering spires, once gleaming in the distant light of 1,000 stars, were now nothing more than skeletal husks. Their shadows stretched long across the ashen ground. The winds howled through the ruins, carrying with them the bitter scent of ash and despair. The Emperor's will was the only law here now. His name, once whispered in reverence, now roared like an unholy incantation, echoing through the wreckage of a civilization that had long since forgotten what it meant to serve him. Tullus had been to many worlds, seen the desolation wrought by endless war, but none had struck him with the weight of this place. The walls of this fallen city were lined with the scorched remains of those who had once pledged their lives to the Emperor. Now they were just bodies, lifeless in the streets, their blood mixed with the dirt that had once been home. It was here, among the shattered remnants of faith, that Tullus truly began to feel the crushing burden of the Emperor's will. Was this what he had fought for? Was this the legacy the Emperor had envisioned for his Imperium? A galaxy consumed by war, where the only law was survival and the only justice was the grave. In the dark recesses of his mind, Tullus found himself grappling with these questions. Questions he had long since buried under the weight of duty and command. But now, with the flames of battle at his back and the ruins of a world underfoot, they pressed upon him with an unrelenting force. He had always believed in the Emperor's divine purpose. He had fought to preserve the Imperium, to defend the weak, to uphold the ideals of humanity against the horrors that sought to tear it asunder. But now, in the silence of the battlefield, with nothing but the distant rattle of gunfire to accompany him, he saw the truth. The Emperor's will was not a force of righteousness. It was a force of unyielding control, of cold calculation. The Imperium was not built on justice or mercy. It was built on blood, iron, and the unwavering submission of those who dared defy it. "Remember your oaths," whispered a voice from behind him. Tullus turned to see the figure of Commissar Valen, his face a mask of cold authority. "Remember why we fight. The Emperor demands it." Tullus didn't respond, his gaze drifting back to the shattered city. The Commissar's words were nothing new. They were the same words spoken to him countless times before. The Emperor demanded obedience, and in return, the Imperium would survive. But at what cost? He had seen enough of the Imperium's harsh realities to know that the Emperor's will came with a price. The men and women who died for his cause were not mere soldiers. They were expendable. The Emperor did not mourn their loss. He did not shed tears for those who fell. He was a god of war, a being beyond the comprehension of mortal men, and his will was the only thing that mattered. The lives of the soldiers, the lives of the civilians, they were insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Tullus had once believed that to serve the Emperor was to serve a noble cause. But now, in the wake of countless battles, countless deaths, he began to wonder if the Emperor had ever truly cared for those who fought in his name. Had the Emperor ever truly seen the soldiers? The men and women who bled for him, or were they simply tools to be discarded once they had outlived their usefulness? The answer, Tullus feared, was becoming clear. The Emperor's will was absolute, and it demanded the sacrifice of everything. But it was not a sacrifice that promised glory, or honor, or redemption. It was a sacrifice that demanded only blood. Endless, unyielding blood. "Move out," Commissar Valen commanded, his voice sharp, breaking Tullus from his thoughts. The squad began to move forward once again, their steps heavy with the weight of their duty. They had no choice but to obey. The Emperor's will was the law, and they were nothing more than instruments of that law. But as Tullus followed his comrades into the heart of the city, his mind lingered on the question that had begun to gnaw at him. Was this truly the Emperor's will, or had it become something else entirely? Something darker, something far more insidious. There was no time to dwell on such thoughts. The enemy forces were closing in, and the battle was far from over. Yet, as the first volley of fire rained down from the opposing line, Tullus couldn't shake the feeling that they were no longer fighting for the Emperor. They were fighting to survive, to live one more day in a galaxy that had forgotten the true meaning of loyalty. The next volley of gunfire erupted in a deafening roar, and Tullus once again found himself submerged in the violence of war. But in the back of his mind, the question remained: what had the Emperor become? What had his will truly wrought? The storm raged overhead, dark clouds swirling like the very wrath of the Emperor himself. Thunder cracked, and the heavens seemed to scream in fury as the soldiers trudged forward, their armor caked with mud and blood. The battlefield, once a place of valor and pride, had long since turned into a haunting, endless expanse of suffering. Here, among the ruins of countless wars, the truth was painfully clear. There was a cost to survival in the Imperium, one that no soldier, no matter how seasoned, could ever truly escape. Tullus had seen the price, felt it in his bones, in the weight of every step he took. He had heard the stories, the whispered rumors in the darkened corridors of war-torn ships, the tales of those who had survived battles only to be left to rot in forgotten corners of the galaxy. It wasn't just death that awaited the soldiers of the Imperium. It was the slow, grinding erosion of everything they once were. There was no honor in this war, no glory in survival, only emptiness. The survivors were haunted, not just by the horrors they had witnessed, but by the weight of their choices, their oaths to the Emperor, the countless lives they had taken, and the lives they had sacrificed to ensure their own survival. They had long since lost the ability to feel remorse. The price of survival had been too high, the cost too great. There was no room for humanity in the Imperium, no place for weakness, for doubt, for questioning. All that mattered was the war, and in that war, everything, everyone had its price. Tullus's thoughts drifted back to the countless soldiers he had known, those who had once fought alongside him, whose names were now nothing more than forgotten whispers. Some had died on the battlefield, their lives snuffed out by the chaos of war. Others had been consumed by the machines of the Imperium, their minds shattered by the horrors they had witnessed, leaving them nothing more than empty husks. They were the lucky ones, the ones who were finally released from the endless suffering of war. But Tullus, like so many others, was not so fortunate. He had lived, and with that life came the burden of the price he had paid. He could still remember the faces of his fallen comrades, their eyes filled with hope, their hearts full of fire. Now in their place there was only the hollow emptiness of survival. There was no more purpose in his life, no more reason to continue. Only the hollow, insatiable need to move forward, to fight, to survive. The horrors of war had a way of stripping a man of his identity, of erasing everything that once made him human. In the beginning, Tullus had been proud to serve the Emperor. He had believed in the cause, in the righteousness of his actions. But now, as he stood in the midst of another charred and desolate world, he could not help but wonder if there had ever been a time when the Imperium had been truly worth serving. The men and women who fought for the Emperor, those who died.
On the battlefield, and those who survived were all pawns in a game they had never asked to play. The Imperium was a machine, and like all machines, it ground down everything in its path. The soldiers were just another cog, another piece in the vast, uncaring machinery that stretched across the galaxy. They fought for survival, not for honor, not for glory, not for the Emperor's will. They fought because they had no choice. "Sergeant," came the voice of Pharos, snapping Tullus out of his reverie. "We're moving out, another skirmish up ahead." Tullus nodded, his heart heavy with the knowledge that the war would never end. There would be no victory, no peace. The cycle of violence would continue until the very last drop of blood had been spilled, until the last soul had been consumed by the flames of the Imperium's endless war machine. They marched on, their steps synchronized, their faces set in grim determination. But inside, Tullus knew the truth. There was no future here, no hope. The Imperium had become a thing of the past, a broken, shattered relic of a once great empire that had long since lost its soul. As they advanced toward the next battle, Tullus found himself questioning everything he had ever known, everything he had ever believed. What was the point of it all? Was this truly the Emperor's will? Or had something darker, something far more insidious, taken its place? The war would never end. Not for them, not for anyone. The price of survival was far greater than anyone could ever have imagined. And as Tullus stood on the precipice of yet another battle, the weight of that truth pressed down on him, a burden that he would carry for the rest of his life. The only question now was whether or not he could still carry it at all.